Welcome to my channel, Comic Book Noise, where we talk about my comic book company, Digital Noise, where we explain the characters and storylines within the Digital Noise universe. Today, we're going to talk about something or somewhat about my comic book company, and it deals with the comic book industry. And it talks about declining sales of why superhero comics are not the big commodity that it used to be. I remember back in the 80s when I started buying comic books. I was a little kid. I was a kid when I started getting into the comic book industry. It was sort of back, I think it was back in 1980, maybe like 82 or 83 or maybe even 86. I was a kid. And my dad bought me my first comic book, and you can look over in old past videos I've done, and we all know it's probably X-Men 127 was my first comic book, and a Red Sonja book. So that influenced my work and my outlook on comic books with working within the industry. But I remember when comic books was sort of coming on the rise. That's when I started getting into comics. I started to see comic books everywhere. They were sold in like 7-Elevens and newsstands and different outlets like that. And then I started to find out that there were, as I got older, there were things called comic book shops that existed. And I think my first comic book shop that I discovered, I think it was called Zeno's, and it was in the mall where I'm from in Florida, my hometown in Florida. And it was called Zeno's. And I used to frequent there a lot. And, you know, me and my best friends would like take trips and every weekend and take 2-hour bus trips because it was far away from where I used to live. And used to buy all kinds of comics. I discovered Teen Titans, and of course I bought the X-Men and all that stuff. I used to spend my weekly allowance every week there, and I was obsessed with comic books. And so that's what made me want to become an artist for my future as a comic book illustrator. And unknowingly, I did not know that I wanted to become a comic book creator and also tell stories and all this other stuff. And that influenced my artwork a lot and everything. And comic books was such like a novel, cool thing. And I remember every other kid, you know, it started to grow. Every other kid around me in schools and things like that, comic books started. Comics weren't taken so seriously back then as they are now. It was sort of like a cool niche for the true geek. And I was basically a true geek by nature. And I used to live in vicariously through the characters that I used to, the titles I used to buy and things like that. So it was a very integral part of my life. And it was just a great time during the 80s. And that's when the beginning of something big in the comic book industry started to happen, was in the 80s. And as I began to grow older, and then I came to New York, and I actually started working for one of the companies I used to idolize, was Marvel, starting in the early 90s. And we all know what happened then during the early 90s. It was like the comic book industry was huge. Like it was like you would touch gold if you did anything from a comic book's perspective. If you were hired as an artist, if you created a comic book back then, even independents were doing great back then. And I mean, for the comic book industry itself, and it was more of the superhero comic book. And I just remember those times, and you know, stars back then of the comic book industry were pretty big and major stars. That's where like Jim Lee and Liefeld and uh, Todd McFarlane, those stars, those huge artists that became like millionaires in the comic book industry during that time. That's how much comic books was a big, huge thing, the comic book industry itself. There weren't any MCU movies or anything like that. It was just the comic book industry was a big thing on its own. And then we get to now in the new millennium, and then comic books started translating to movies. In the year 2000, that's when I saw the big transition of comic books start to get on screen. The first big movie I remember from Marvel was Blade, and that was such a huge hit in the comic book industry. And it was such a huge feat. It did it very well. It was like number one for a couple of weeks, which was pretty surprising. And with a minor character that they tested out, that Marvel tested out the movie industry with a character, it was huge success. And then I remember, I think the next step was the X-Men. The first trilogy of the X-Men in the movie industry. And I think it may be Sony. I think it was Sony or somebody who started it wasn't Marvel itself that came up with it. It was Sony. Or another, I don't know who, but it wasn't Marvel themselves. And this was pre-Disney. So when the X-Men came out, and that made huge bucks. And as we have now, we have the Avengers, which is totally a Marvel Disney owned thing, which is a huge hit right now. But though as the movie industry with the comics turned out to be the main blockbuster, they basically took over Hollywood when you translate comic books into movies. They took over Hollywood basically and took over the crown of blockbusters. So, but the comic book industry itself started to dwindle, and it was a pretty odd thing to see that something that Hollywood made billions from now, which are comic books in the superhero comic book genre, the sales of the comic book itself from the superhero genre the sales started to be low, and it started to change the comic book industry. And for many facets of reasons, because of new movements coming in and certain agendas coming in the comic book industry once the comic book industry started making money, and just a whole lot. Then there's social media, then there's other outlets of entertainment started to come in. And the superhero genre is not doing well right now. I mean, as far as the mainstream goes, I mean, you can tell that from recent things happening. I hate to say it because every time I mention it, I get some backlash on either side of it. There's things like Comicsgate, which started as a movie. You can look at a video about that, what I've learned so far about it. Now I'm learning new things about it that probably progressed. And also I guess you want to call it the SJW agendas and everything, and it just the whole comic book industry itself uh, started to become a battleground of politics for some reason. So instead of just having fun and being creative and everything, I think that affected the comic book industry a lot. When we talk about the superhero genre going down, things, the genre that's doing amazing now, which is in the vein of a comic book, are manga type books and manga novels. And those things I think are doing great because those books just are creative outlets and they just want to tell a story and they just, um, they have no agendas but to entertain you. Yes, there may be some political or moral of the message type things in there, but I don't think that it's there just because there's a pinpoint agenda to do that. I think it's there because it came out of a creative outlet instead of a intended agenda. So I think what we need to look at in the comic book industry from the superhero genre point is, again, as I discussed in many videos before, is to just be creative and tell your stories. Let the story create itself, and the story's coming from you, so it's going to have a certain view from you anyway. What your beliefs are, how you see the world. It's going to have its own stance, but it's not going to feel forced. And it's not, and that's what I think people innately feel when they read or look at art. And I think a lot of that is missing in the mainstream comics today. But what's doing really well now are independent books, because I think generations have changed as well, their attitudes. Like I myself is a Generation Xer. So what my generation comes from, it comes from this, I saw the start, my generation created the iPhone. It was within the creation of computers when they started out, video games, the whole nine. So that's where you have your, I guess Bill Gates, I don't know if Bill Gates is older. That's why you have your Mark Zuckerbergs. That's where you have your Jeff Bezos. That's where you have so many of the tech software dudes come from is my generation. And so this generation developed into another generation, which are the new millennials. So new millennials practically grew up from those creations that we created with the cell phones and things like that. They grew up with the new technologies that my generation created. And now with the new generation, which is coming up, and these are Generation Z. The Generation Zs are it's a very cool generation. As the difference between Generation Z and a generation, the Gen X, I think it is. No, wait a minute. They're the Gen Xers and they're the Generation Z. No, wait a minute. Hold on. I'm saying I'm a Gen X, right? They're the new millennials, and after us are the new millennials, and then there are the Generation Z. So the difference between the millennials and the Generation Zs, the millennials are more like fight the power. They want to work against the system. They're almost like a rebel type generation. They're more abrasive. They're more speak their minds. They're more I wouldn't say more angry. They're more in conflict against the standard norms. And you can see that when you get on social media. You can see that when you put out something and they want to review it, you know what I mean? It's almost like they have a gripe against society. It's almost like that type of thing, which is good. I think it's great that push forward social issues and that pushes politics and everything. But what I find also that's different from the millennials or the Gen Xers, they're more calm. They're more like laid back and study the situation and see how they can fix it. They're more like, instead of you need to change this so I can be comfortable type thing, and they're more like, I can do this on my own and I can change my life and I can make my life better myself. They're more have a positive. The Gen Zs have a better positive outlook on life. And also what I discovered, the Generation Zers, they read more. But what they don't read are mainstream things now. They read more by word of mouth or something that's more like of an underground type of book, and things like that. So they read more independent books as well, instead of Marvel or DC or something that's established that is very commercial. So I think the comic book industry is changing, and it doesn't mean it's changing for bad or good. It's just changing with the times now. And I think, for independent comic book creators, this is a time now to really push out your work, really make a stamp on it. That's why I'm relaunching and rebranding my books. And I'm coming out with everything in 2021 in a different way. From when I first put out my comic book run, it was pretty successful too. I mean, I don't mean to toot my own horn, but my comic book titles were different and innovative. And in 2000, when I came out with my books in 2006, it wasn't your standard comic book superhero type book, and I got a lot of good feedback and notoriety with my titles, with Delete, with The Positive Omen, and now, with these two titles I'm relaunching, I'm also having two other titles that I'm adding to the fire, which are coming out in 2021. 2021. Which are The Sound System and Red Alert. So you'll be watching out with these when I come up with these titles. So I think what we need to do is really follow the current of today's generation and future generations to come, and really concentrate and look at that. And our comic books need to reflect who we are and what we want to say as an artist, as far as art is concerned. Do the art of what your project or title is. And I think people could appreciate that no matter what generation they're in. So, but we also at the same time need to look at how we market uh, our titles and comic books. And we need to, as independents, because the time is now where we can display it. There have been many successful independent titles, good or bad, that have been going through crowdfunding and just other avenues in that realm. So I think it's great. I think it's good for all people that love and want to be in the comic book industry. I think it's time for you now that you can shine and create your own and see what sticks out there. And there's an audience for everyone. I think if you tell a story, there'll be an audience that will identify with your story and what you're trying to do. So it may look down in the comic book industry right now with all what's happening. You know, I'm hearing things about DC, doing chopping blocks. I'm also hearing some things that Marvel may be going through some major changes, but it could be growing pains as well. So, but I don't think comic books will ever die. I think it's the marketing and the way you tell them. And we just need to go with the flow. But the first thing we need to do is just tell great stories and create great characters. And everything else will just fall along the way and just be current. And just know that certain things are out there to help you market your book easier than it was back in the early 80s. And, just have fun and enjoy. If you like what you're hearing, like, share, subscribe. Be safe out there, be healthy, and take care.